Thank you everyone for tuning in to PAVE's second virtual panel of 2021. We are trying to spend the month of January looking ahead to the year, what's going to happen in the AV space, both in industry and across government and in communities. And there are lots of interesting things happening at the state level. And so we wanted to take a look at some of the cool, innovative efforts that different states are doing. And we thought a good way to do that was to profile one state as a case study of some good examples of things that people are working on. And we chose Michigan, although I want to be clear, we could have chosen many, many different states. And so I want to introduce our three panelists here to talk about what's going on in Michigan. Trevor Pawl, who is the Chief Mobility Officer of Michigan's Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, I'm sorry. Collin, who's the Program Manager at the Michigan Department of Transportation's Intelligent Transportation Systems. And Amanda Roraff, who is with Ford, who is the co-founder of the AV Mobility Corridor team. You all have wonderfully descriptive titles. And in full transparency, I will admit that I'm a Michigan native, so all of this tugs at my heartstrings just a little bit. We chose Michigan both because it has a really cool project that they just announced last summer that we want to talk about that's technologically interesting, but it also gets to the heart of kind of PAVE's existence, which is about relationships and collaboration. And that's where we want to start. Michigan has developed an entire ecosystem for future mobility that brings in academia and government and industry under one broad umbrella that they call Planet M. And Trevor, I want to just start with you. I'm wondering if you can give us a broad sense of what Planet M is and the kinds of development work being done in Michigan with future mobility.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, really the next 10 years are going to be a landmark for mobility and electrification. And in fact, just about 6 months ago, our governor announced the new Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, which Planet M lives under. And the idea of this office was to create one entity that focused both on policy and on strategic public-private partnerships that deploy new technologies that not only sort of stimulate investment and grow our economy, but also just make it a little easier to move around. And so really over the last 6 months, we've been in search of really interesting public-private partnerships. And the one at the top of that list so far has been the Detroit to Ann Arbor corridor that Collin and his team are leading. Essentially, it's the road of the future. It's a dedicated AV lane that isn't just technology for technology's sake, but it's meant to integrate into existing transportation networks around the movement of people and goods. And so, you know, the way that our governor looks at it, the way that I know the Michigan Department of Transportation looks at it, and our industry, Ford, the way that they look at it, is the future's multimodal, the future's inclusive, and Michigan can leverage its leadership in automotive over the last 120 years to lead in these new spaces as well. So a lot to talk about here. So I'm really happy to be on the panel. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And Collin, so, you know, the title of the panel is All AVs Are Local, which is true on a number of levels, that when you're looking at these kinds of projects and programs, we need to look at local needs and the deployments that target local mobility and what specific social needs are in any community. What are some of the unique needs that Michigan hopes to address with AVs and how they're affecting your work?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So, you know, I think it's probably no secret to a lot of folks, at least in Michigan, that, you know, in Southeast Michigan, you know, there's probably some to be desired transit services or transportation services. And so I think with this project, it's a really unique opportunity to apply the technology to, you know, serve, for example, you know, underserved populations with equitable transportation options. You know, I think another need obviously is being able to, you know, serve persons with disabilities and be able to apply, you know, accessible, you know, options, obviously utilizing the technologies that are being implemented as part of this project. I think one of the interesting things, at least from my perspective, as it affects my work, is the fact that a lot of the conversations are related to, you know, the technology or what are the needs of the infrastructure or what's the regulatory environment. But this really allows us to get directly to talk to the users of the technology. So So really getting to the individuals who have, you know, a mobility need and being able to say, how would you use this corridor? How would you use these technologies? And so I think that's been the really exciting part for me is really trying to get to the core of why the technology is important, as opposed to just, having the hammer looking for a nail. There's plenty of nails, and we should be able to use these technologies to solve those problems. So
Absolutely. And you've both mentioned the whole idea of the partnership. And we talk on PAVE's panels a lot about those public-private partnerships and how they are important throughout the AV development process. Obviously, a lot of the work is done at the state DOT level, but Amanda, I'm curious if you can talk about how private companies like Ford are involved and how they're participating, particularly in Michigan.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So many know, first of all, that Ford is invested in Argo AI, a level 4 self-driving company. The connected and automated vehicle corridor, the Michigan connected corridor that we're building, that I think Trevor and Collin are going to describe in a few minutes. The real value and what we're really interested in exploring is, could smart infrastructure help accelerate the deployment of lower level autonomous vehicles? So could an L2 plus L3 type vehicle essentially, leverage that smart infrastructure, and the driver could then have an eyes off, hands off experience? We also look at this too with the connected and automated vehicle corridor concept, is it could potentially bridge that gap between human drivers and driverless drivers. As we know, they're going to intermix for a long time. So what we were thinking too is that there's, an opportunity to leverage a corridor like this to bring connected and automated vehicle benefits to a broader spectrum of people even sooner than what was expected. So that's really kind of one element on the specific to AV side. Specific more to Ford, though, is many know also that Ford has made a major investment in Michigan Central Station, which is in Corktown, Detroit's oldest neighborhood. We're building a large ecosystem, an open innovation platform in which companies will come from all over the world to test and deploy and work together and to develop new and next generation mobility technologies. So while the actual specific corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor and the airport hasn't been exactly determined, what we do know is that it will run along Michigan Avenue, which is in the front door of Michigan Central and the ecosystem that we're building there. It also, potentially could connect our two major campuses between our world headquarters in Dearborn and downtown Detroit. And frankly, we have a growing presence in Ann Arbor as well. So we see an opportunity to really bring those all together as well.
That's great. Well, and actually, and we're all talking about the projects. I want to kind of give a big overview. Trevor, I'm wondering if you can do that. So last summer, Michigan announced this connected and automated vehicle corridor along I-94 for the non-Michigan audience, connects Ann Arbor, where University of Michigan is, with downtown Detroit, and goes right by Detroit's big airport, Detroit Metro. But I'm wondering if you can tell us what the project is and where the idea came from.
Yeah, sure. So the Detroit to Ann Arbor corridor is the busiest and most strategic route in the state for a variety of reasons. One of which is that you have Detroit on one end and Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan on the other, but also our major airport is in the middle, as well as Dearborn, which is Ford's headquarters, and another large regional city in Ypsilanti, and Eastern Michigan University. So there are a lot of different environments within that corridor: urban environments, suburban environments, highway, service routes. And the goal, I think, for decades has been to ensure that that corridor is something that has the ability to lead other corridors around the state, and the technology that is adopted in the ways that we're looking at sustainability, charging infrastructure, how a public transit network interacts with a large corridor. There are various needs, and MDOT really has been I would say, at the leading edge nationally of looking at sort of larger strategic corridor strategies. And so when our governor came into office, we began to rethink public-private partnerships around the corridor, and MDOT released an RFP for co-developers to look at, given the advances in autonomous technology and electrification, what could we do that would be a first in the world? What could we do that would actually fit into the existing traffic patterns and the different variables that we have? And Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which is one of the most prolific infrastructure investors in the world, backed by Alphabet, Google's parent company, ended up winning the RFP and created a company called Cavenue. And Cavenue is focused on reinventing the road and really looking at infrastructure in 4 different ways. Physical infrastructure, so thinking about separation barriers, materials in the road, enhanced machine readable markings, digital infrastructure, think like HD maps, high accuracy ground-based GPS, coordination infrastructure, ensuring that there's interoperability between communities. There's like 50 or so communities between Detroit and Ann Arbor, 2 counties. And then operational infrastructure, so just making sure that it's a good experience for the customer, whether it's a smart curb or just the passenger experience. And really right now we're in phase 1. It was announced in August, 24-month period, to kind of look at and answer some difficult questions around roadway design, edge cases, even some of the policies and revenue models we're going to have to consider over time. And the goal will be to have a plan after phase 1 that then we can ultimately put into action. But this isn't necessarily us just sort of in a dark, smoky room figuring this out. You know, there's a lot of community engagement going on right now. And I think even before the end of the 24 months, you're going to begin to see technology activations along the corridor.
Absolutely. And then delving into that just a little bit more, Collin, I want to talk about the idea about smart infrastructure, and that, you know, traditionally there's been this idea that we needed specific technology for AVs. And then, you know, as we progress, that some companies now talk about driving automation that's agnostic in terms of infrastructure, that it can equally travel on any street. Curious why Michigan's looking at AV specific infrastructure along in the CAV corridor project, and sort of what the motivations and thoughts are behind that.
Yeah, and I think Trevor actually touched on a number of these. So you know, I think what it boils down to is, yes, in communicating with, you know, the AV developers, you know, a lot of them feel that there's not a ton that can be done, you know, from an infrastructure perspective. But, you know, what we're finding is that, you know, there's specific, you know, edge cases. Obviously, they're very challenging. I think that's where, when you talk about, you know, removing the driver from the vehicle, you have to be 100% certain that you're able to operate effectively. And so, you know, being able to limit some of those edge cases. So for example, limiting the amount of interaction that you have with, you know, human drivers, for example, and being able to have, you know, infrastructure dedicated to AVs. You know, I think Trevor touched on, you know, the fact coordination. So if you're really trying to, for example, gain some of those massive efficiencies that everyone projects out into the future, you need to be able to coordinate your infrastructure, you know, with those vehicles. So for example, at a signalized intersection, being able to ensure that, you know, these vehicles can effectively, you know, operate in that type of scenario. You know, Trevor touched on another one, which is kind of more operational infrastructure. So if you don't have, for example, a good location for these vehicles to stop and, you know, load up and drop off, you could create, you know, more challenges with congestion and bottlenecking. So I think what it boils down to is, if you're trying to really get to that future vision of fully safe AVs that folks are willing to trust, and then you're also being able to gain all of those efficiencies that folks feel, you know, could be achieved through automated vehicles. This is a good first step in being able to identify some of those challenges that may exist. And then ultimately, maybe this corridor is one implementation, but this can be rolled out to other corridors within the state. These best practices about what to invest in can be shared with, you know, other states to ultimately identify, as states are making, you know, investments, long-term infrastructure decision-making related to infrastructure, you know, they can take into consideration some of these kind of additional investments that could really help take the technologies to the next level.
Right. And actually that brings up, when people register for these panels, we give them the opportunity to send in questions. And the most common topic that came up and the questions we got about was about data collection. Kind of like you said, you want to take lessons learned and apply it other places. And so a lot of people ask questions along the lines of what data will be collected, how will it be used, who will store it and warehouse it. Amanda, can you address that?
That one's probably best for the state. Collin, I'm gonna punt this one. Being the lead on the project, I think it's probably best for Collin to address that today.
Great.
So obviously, yeah, data governance and privacy and access is really important to the conversation. And so, currently the way that we're approaching this is that, we're looking to obviously access data that's important to make sure that there's safe, efficient operation of the corridor, but it has to be done in a way that protects individuals' privacy. We need to have to make sure that it's done in a way that, anonymizes any data that, is personally identifiable, for example. And so I think as part of the project, that's one of the initial things that's being established is the strategy for data ownership, governance, access. And a lot of that will be led by the state of Michigan. Obviously, this is not the first instance of where the state potentially has access to or houses sensitive data. I mean, you think about the Secretary of State, for example, and all the transactions that occur there. And so the state is going to obviously play a role potentially if we, handle some ownership or of the operation of the corridor. There may be some data that is utilized by that third party like a Cavenue. And so I think, ultimately it's probably going to be up to the state to identify kind of what the governance model looks like. But as I talked about, all those considerations will need to be taken, privacy by design, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Absolutely. And then Amanda, I'll come back to you. The AV sector is a competitive business. And one of the cool things about this project is they took a lot of fierce competitors and all joined together to work on one collaborative issue. And I wondered if you can talk about that process. What were the challenges and how did that work?
Yeah, I would say that Cavenue took a really smart approach to how it addresses that. So it's created an advisory committee with 10 or 12 or so, major AV developers, OEMs, and AV tech companies, including Ford, Argo, and Waymo, GM, Toyota, Honda, BMW, May Mobility, Too Simple. I'm forgetting a couple of them. But that's really the important approach. And frankly, Ford's involvement in this project is really reliant on that, right? So that was part of our decision to join, because frankly, if you build a roadway system that only one OEM can access or operate on or interact with, it's not beneficial to all. And that's not the point, right? So we're really looking for transportation for all, provide equitable access to transportation. So what we're here to do is really advocate for an open standard that's available to all OEMs and all AV tech companies. So I think that Cavenue is taking the right approach here and through this advisory committee capacity. Ford happened to be involved from the front end, right? So for all the reasons we've talked about already this afternoon. But again, we're here, and we were actually helpful in introducing Cavenue to some of our competitors as well, to get them to the table to sign up and participate in the advisory committee.
Fantastic. And Trevor, I want to ask you, obviously, what PAVE does is we believe that the AVs offer a lot of potential in terms of safety and mobility and sustainability, but that we are much more likely to achieve that potential if the public's on board. And I'm curious in this instance, how this has been received by the public and what efforts you all are making to get the public on board with the project.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is it wasn't all positive. Of course not.
Yeah.
I think there was some trepidation early on from city planners who were worried it was going to interrupt existing service, bus routes, or new investments. One of the big things that MDOT is religious towards is integrated asset management, meaning that if you finish a road and then 2 years later you tear it up to put in new technology, what good is that? And how much in taxpayer dollars is lost? I think some of these counties and some of these locals who rely so heavily on regional transit, they're worried about that, especially when in some cases, you're taking up a lane that's used every day. This isn't just sort of access road that we're repurposing. And what I've noticed though in all of those cases, instead of just doing reports out to 60, 70 different individuals on one Zoom call, going one by one, answering questions in an open and candid way, not only with city planners and transit authority officials, universities, but also with the public itself. And I've been really impressed so far with Cavenue. and their ability to reach out, at least specifically in the Corktown neighborhood, the part of Detroit where there's going to be emphasis first, near downtown. It's very near to Michigan Central Station, which Amanda referred to as a pretty large investment made by Ford, a transformative project for that neighborhood. And I think the other key to victory here is to ensure, as I mentioned earlier, as we roll out different technology activations on this corridor, that we're explaining them, that we understand, like people understanding like how this makes their lives better. And frankly, it's things that can add to the vitality of a community. Are there technologies that you can roll out that can be fun to watch or fun to experience, where someone could literally say, hey, let's go, have dinner and let's go down to the technology corridor and see what new technologies are available, inspire youth to look at STEM careers. This can be a true, and the term I keep hearing since I've gotten involved here, a true living lab. Yeah. And so I think the takeaway from everything I just gave you there is, I think there needs to be these one-on-one sort of Q&A sessions in time with groups and key individuals, but also there needs to be more of this visceral back and forth that I think that will be critical, and that so far the team's gotten off to a good start doing.
Great. Collin, another thing I'm curious about is Michigan has obviously put a lot of work in developing this ecosystem, Planet M, but most cars drive out of the state. And I'm wondering where you see places for, collaboration between states, or if there's a role for some sort of federal coordination. How would that affect deployments and smart infrastructure?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, Michigan DOT, along with another number of other state DOTs, we're part of what's called AASHTO. It's the American Association of State Transportation Officials. And so, as part of that, we have things like cooperative automated transportation systems working groups where, states are really sharing all of those best practices associated with, the lessons they've learned about having, low speed shuttles and AVs, or, legislation that's been enacted in their state to allow for automated vehicles to operate. And so, that's a really good forum where the outcomes from this project can be, shared directly with other states to be able to inform them about what's going on. Federal Highway Administration, they obviously, have a strong play in this. And so they have things like, a national ConOps for automated driving systems and a national strategy for transportation automation. So, you have these really grandiose efforts that are underway that are looking for inputs into real world application. And so being able to implement this corridor, take those lessons learned and share those with, state collaborations or federal kind of activities, I think are going to be really, really key. So that's how we intend to share and plug into those.
That's fantastic. And Amanda, so this is obviously the big thing that Michigan is working on right now. Curious where you go next. What do you see? What else is needed or what's missing? What do you see next steps, either, both in this project and after this?
Well, sure. And, we're looking at today we're talking about the deployment of EVs with a dedicated corridor in Michigan. To that point, what I think is also important is that what was intended when this was launched and, announced back in August of 2020 is that this particular corridor is intended to be the place, as Trevor inferred, as a living lab. It's the place where the model of a corridor such as this could be built out, tested, deploy, and kind of iterate to build out what that model looks like. And with Cavenue having this idea of actually deploying corridors nationally. So imagine, today it's Detroit to Ann Arbor, but in the future it could connect to Chicago. You can have different regions. So we do definitely think there's a lot of opportunity here, again, as I mentioned early on, for us to explore pulling ahead and accelerating the deployment of lower level connected vehicles and create a more, higher level autonomous experience. I think there's an incredible opportunity, I think, as Trevor also alluded to, from a community engagement and education and awareness around AVs. I think this is a tremendous opportunity to do that. And I think that, again, with our investment in Michigan Central, I think we'll be able to help support the state and Cavenue as they do that as well, especially through our engagement and providing tech support and mobility services, as well as, leverage the investments that we've made in our campuses as well throughout Southeast Michigan.
Fantastic. So I think we probably only have time for one more question, but I'd like for all to get each of your take on this. We've talked a lot about partnerships and all of the, cross collaboration and what the state is doing in industry. What would you say are some of the greatest successes between these partnerships, the biggest takeaways, lessons learned? What, and like you said, looking at best practices, kind of what has Michigan learned that you would teach other states?
Do you want me to start?
Sure. Go ahead, Amanda.
Okay,
Sorry.
sure. I jump in because there's a lot of successes. I mean, there's a lot of best practices, but a couple of things that I think we're definitely doing right in this particular project, looking at from a public-private partnership and the number of stakeholders that this involves. And first is there's been a deep evaluation and dive into the existing regional transit plans, as well as the local transit and mobility plans, to ensure that the needs of local communities are also being met as the rollout of a corridor like this exists, and what types of technologies could benefit which communities. And it might vary, and we might be solving slightly different problems for different ends of the corridor as well. Detroit's issues might be slightly different. Maybe there's more congestion issues, in the Ann Arbor side of the corridor. So I think that's one key, is really being very inclusive of all of, because there's 13 or so communities and municipalities along this just one short corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor, but tremendous opportunity to connect those two tech hubs. And the second one is just really around the energy around this project. I mean, yes, there are, a couple of individuals who maybe are a little bit hesitant to jump on board, which they should be, right? This is a huge lift. It's a big undertaking. But I think there's a lot of energy and excitement. And as I mentioned, the inclusiveness of the diverse types of people that are involved, that are today sitting at the table, that are talking about what tech and infrastructure will be needed to make this successful, what policy modifications will be needed, what's the business model for this? How does planning and design maybe look different than how it's been done before, even community engagement, et cetera. So I think it's just, we're taking the right approach, kind of slow and steady, inclusive, and being really transparent.
Absolutely. Trevor, what are your comments about that? What are the lessons learned and takeaways?
Yeah, I think for me, over the last couple of years, we've been able to initiate a lot of different pilot deployments that often will go 3, 6, 9 months, where a corporate or a startup comes with a technology solution to solve a local barrier that a public sector infrastructure owner has. It could be a hospital, college campus, city sidewalk. And oftentimes the focus is so much on just launching the pilot, getting it out there to help people. A lot of these pilots end up expiring because there isn't a business model, especially in this new environment where the world's changing every day. And as a government official, you have tough choices to make as to whether you lay the tracks for the future, or you help a small business stay open for 6 more months through a relief check. And I think the answer is pretty easy there. I think you have to help that small business, but you also can't turn your back on the future, because all of the pandemic and all the different things that we're going through, it will pass, and we want to make sure that through this decade and beyond, Michigan continues to be a leader in its most important industry. So to me, I think, to answer your question, it'll be important that we make really smart investment decisions, learn from our mistakes on pilots, and continue to look at the different barriers and ensure that we're not just, the future of automotive is very, very important, and it's something that is core, but core to everything we think about every day. But the truth is, we need to think about a multimodal future, mobility by air, land, space, and sea, because I think that's where the world is going.
Absolutely. And Collin, you get the final thoughts. Any?
What they said? No, I think honestly, it's really the ability to have open dialogue with the users of our infrastructure, not only the public, but the technology, the OEMs, the suppliers, the ADS developers. And, there's a lot of speculation about the need or the lack thereof of investments that support the technology. So being able to have that conversation directly to really understand, is it just a simple widening of a lane marking? Is it connectivity at a signalized intersection? You know, really kind of dispelling the myth associated with the need or the lack thereof, and being able to come to a conclusion about these are things that infrastructure owner operators can be doing now to future-proof their infrastructure. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a fun project to watch last, several months, and we'll be excited to see where it continues to go. Yeah, great to see all the wonderful things the state is doing, and thank you all for taking the time today to join us and talk about it. And everyone else, thank you for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you next time at our virtual panel.